Our story begins.
Hello, my name is Logan, and I'm delighted to have the chance to supply an analogue track for this Media Asia DVD release of Fist of Fury. Just to establish my credentials, or rather the lack of them, unfortunately I didn't get to work on the original movie Fist of Fury, but it's one of my favourite all-time movies, certainly one of my favourite all-time Hong Kong martial art films, and I feel the best of Bruce Lee's Hong Kong produced films. So, and as I'm the author of a book called Hong Kong Action Cinema, I've been asked and drafted in to come and talk about the film and try to offer some background information and insight into its production and into the film itself. Here we are at the opening, and Bruce Lee as Chen Jun, a young martial arts student, returns to Shanghai and to the school where he learnt martial arts to find that his master, Fot Yun Gap, has died. And interestingly, Bruce is already wearing white, even though he doesn't know at this point that his master has passed away. White being the Chinese colour of death, where we wear white for weddings, Hong Kong people, Chinese people wear white for funerals. So he learns that Fot Yun Gap has died, and he's going to go to the graveyard. There's an interesting moment here, a little bit of foreshadowing. The guy here who works in the school, he watches him go, and something about him, the audience is thinking, The band striking up that wonderful old Welsh hymn, Abide With Me. And the constructing of the shots here is quite nice. We start off at the grave, and then we keep moving back. You get two people, and then a group of people, and then the whole crowd, and we're moving further and further away from the action until Bruce Lee arrives, and then suddenly it's very immediate, and the whole scene, suddenly the tone of the scene suddenly changes. This is actually an interior at Golden Harvest Studios with a rain machine. Most of the film was shot inside the studio, and that accounts, I think, for the fact there's a uniformity to its style, which isn't present in the other Bruce Lee movies. I think with the interior sets you could actually create an environment and sustain it, whereas with the other films, which are shot mainly on location, there's a lot of other elements that affect how the picture will look, such as whether you have good weather on consecutive days. Here they could really control the environment, and it pays off. The film, even today, looks really nicely designed. Here we have an unusual response to a hysterical person. The senior from the school is watching Chen Jun, who's hysterical, tearing at the grave of his late master. And what does he do in the way of consoling him? Yes, he's holding a spade, and he takes a look at it, and then of course he whacks him on the head, which is what you would do with a hysterical person. It's no wonder Bruce spends the rest of the film killing people. The opening credits, you notice Bruce Lee has his hair slicked back in certain shots. That was meant to be his hairstyle, but they had to abandon it because his hair kept flying in all directions. He wasn't flying off like a wig, but there were like bits of his hair were sticking up when he was into action. It didn't look as good as him wearing his hair in his normal hairstyle. These kind of Andy Warhol-esque credits, I mean, pop art was all the rage. We're in 1971, but that's still the thing that was hot in Hollywood. And the characters in the background, the Chinese bright characters coming out, actually are the title of the film in Chinese, Zheng Momun. Zheng is excellence, Mo is martial, and Mun is a doorway or a gateway. My apologies to all you Chinese speakers for my poor pronunciation, but that's the meaning of the film, the doorway to excellence in martial arts, and that's the name of the school run by Fot Yun Gap, the school that Chen Jun belongs to in the film. Credit there to Han Yan-git as the fight instructor. Actually, the choreography of the fights were meant to be handled by Han Yan-git, but in reality on the stage they were constructed by Bruce Lee. But out of respect for an elder, which is a key element of Chinese tradition, Bruce gave credit to Han Yan-git, even though the actual fights were arranged by Bruce Lee. Here's the lovely leading lady, Nora Miao Kersu, in a really nicely appointed set. I mean, all the sets here are really nicely done. That picture you see there is actually the real historical Fot Yun Gap. And the film itself is set in Shanghai during a period when this Chinese city was divided into foreign concessions.
You'll make yourself sick.
And Chinese people were indeed downtrodden by the various imperial powers, and particularly by the Japanese, which is the focus of what this movie is about. And Fok Ying Gap is alleged to have fought Japanese fighters and even to have been challenged to fight a Western strongman, a boxer or wrestler. And so a lot of the events of his life are now being told in this film, but they've been transferred to this imagined character who is Chen Jun, his #1 student, as played by Bruce Lee. And you notice the way that this thing is staged is that we really get our money's worth. Every time we're inside Jengmonmun, we get these kind of tracking shots and pan shots from the camera to really show the detail that went into the building of the set up at the Golden Harvest Studios. Here we have the school's elder, the surviving elder, and he's a fine veteran actor, Tian Feng. He worked in King Hu's films and is always, even at quite a young age, was cast as like a big brother or a fatherly figure. There he is on the left of the shot. And he kept working many years after Fist of Fury. You can see him in John Woo's film A Better Tomorrow, and you can see him, the last big film I remember him being in was Miracles, the Jackie Chan movie. He plays the father figure in there. And the middle guy, and the three of the other students, is Lei Kun, who was a popular Cantonese comic actor. So he's playing quite a serious role here. Normally he played very outrageously comic characters. And on the other guy, just to the right of the three, is James Chen Jun. And he was a leading light at Golden Harvest even before Bruce Lee came back from America to make films at the company, and got bumped back to supporting roles. When Bruce Lee came back to make The Big Boss, known in America as Fists of Fury, his first Golden Harvest film, James Chen was actually already signed to be the star of that picture, because they needed to put Bruce in the film right away. They pushed him to second billing, second lead. He dies halfway through, and then Bruce gets to be the star. So he had an unfortunate career. It was unfortunate for him, let's say, that Bruce came back when he did. And most of the players in the movie are Golden Harvest contract players, people who've been signed up by the company that was actually quite young at that stage. We've had the exterior funeral. Now in Chinese tradition we have like a eulogy, which is being read out by this gentleman. And interesting, he also lived a long time after Fist of Fury, and he actually appeared in an ATV series, Kung Fu Master, that I was involved with a few years ago. And so he was still with us. And in this sequence, we see he's basically telling the audience and telling the people in the gathering about the life of Fok Ying Gap, who was Fok Ying Gap. Notice the way Bruce is in white and everybody else is in dark clothing. This, again, it's a way that you highlight the star of the piece, and it's a very stylized, dramatic thing. And it's interesting the way that a lot of the imagery and the staging here owes more to the theatre than perhaps it does to filmmaking. And you really see diverse hands at work, because some of the material was shot by Lo Wai himself, who was the director of credit, some by Han Yan-git, who directed some of the action scenes, and of course quite a bit by Bruce Lee, uncredited, himself. And the scenes that are the most theatrical and the more stagey are from from Han Yan-git and Lo Wei, and the scenes that are more cinematic tend to be from Bruce Lee, who had a more Hollywood and more westernized sense of the cinematic, of how to move the camera, how to use the camera. And we get this nice pan shot here along most leading players. That's Lao Wing, who was his first film was The Big Boss, Bruce Lee's first film, and he went on to become a leading star. Unicorn Chan, Xu Geilan, on the right there, he's childhood friend of Bruce Lee's. He died a few years ago, and he was in all the Bruce Lee films except for Enter the Dragon. Again, we have this talk going on, and again, it's probably quite stagey. In Hong Kong, if you were doing a modern-day action film in America or Hong Kong, you probably wouldn't have this long speech. But I think at the time Fist of Fury was made, they really wanted to establish for a worldwide audience, or maybe for a more modern audience, who the hero Fok Ying Gap was. And you have your moment of silent prayer, and of course, here come the bad guys, led by Wei Ping-oh, who passed away a few years ago, playing an interpreter for a rival Japanese school. He's like a kind of a Hong Kong version of Peter Lorre. I mean, he always played these snivelling, weaselly, evil characters on screen. And off camera is this very cultured, refined, pleasant man. And just his physical look meant that he was cast always as the interpreter, particularly after Fist of Fury. I mean, he played the same role, what amounts to the same role in various other films, including Hapkido, which was shot later the same year, and various of the rip-off movies that came out after Bruce died, Fist of Fury 2, 3, 4, they would hire him to be in the film. He unfortunately suffered from jaundice in his later life, and he passed away a few years ago. And they delivered this sign, Dong A Beng Fu, sick men of Asia. And this was a real term that was used by the Japanese, particularly to describe Chinese people. They were the sick men of Asia, because Japan, as such a small territory, had conquered so much of Asia and made such inroads into China that the Japanese, the very militaristic, nationalistic, right-wing Japanese elements who were in power at the time, called the Chinese the sick men of Asia. And here we're setting up something that the local audience, the first audience to see this movie in Hong Kong, would really react to. The idea that somebody was standing up for the Chinese people as a race and saying, we're not sick men, that the Chinese were as strong and as brave as anybody else on the planet. And people at the time, 1971, the memory of the war years and this brutal oppression that had taken place under the Japanese occupation was very fresh in their mind. And after the war, Hong Kong people didn't get any kind of freedom in the sense that some of the other states had become independent after World War II. They were still a British colony. So a lot of Hong Kong people, maybe they felt they were second-class citizens. And there's this sequence here which would really kind of adds to that, fuels that, plays off of that. And the audience are like itching for Bruce to go into action. And it's very nicely staged in that he's constantly restraining himself at this stage. So the audience is like waiting for him to erupt into the middle of the room and decimate these three intruders. And of course, out of respect for his master's memory, he can't do that because it's the eulogy ceremony, and so he has to contain himself. And Bruce could actually do more by saying nothing than many actors could do with 5-10 pages of dialogue. And I think that's part of his appeal, because he just, on camera, conveyed emotion in a very pure and raw sense. And I think that's why people of all nationalities admire him and like his work, is because he doesn't have to be speaking their language. He kind of already does, physically, speak their language. And the other great thing about him is that most of the martial arts stars who've come since, when they're not actually kicking and punching on screen, they're not that interesting. But with Bruce Lee, even like now when he's in the background of a shot, you're looking at him. You're not looking at the other people, whoever's talking, whatever other movement there might be. With his screen presence, he's just there, and the eye goes to him. And I think that's probably one element that makes somebody a star. It also helps, of course, that he's wearing that white suit. Years before John Travolta made it popular in Saturday Night Fever, he's wearing a white suit and nobody else is. And constantly throughout the film we have these zoom-ins to Bruce's face, and he's one of the faces, probably one of the few faces of this era of Hong Kong cinema that really deserves that kind of attention, because there's always so much going on in terms of energy.
It won't work.
And his look, that piercing look.
Why so shy?
At this stage, of course, the audience will be in a white-knuckle stage of fury. They're waiting for Bruce to strike back. And it's the structure of the film is very smart. Normally in this kind of movie, you have an insult at the beginning of the film, and then our hero goes away to train in the jungle for like 10 years, and then he comes back at the end to take revenge. But here, it's revenge in the next scene. Look at this nice staging. Everybody goes out after the Japanese. They don't do anything, they're just talking. It's an outrage, it's terrible. Bruce is left standing alone. And then we whip back towards Bruce and zoom in, and then from that we know what's going to happen next. And sure enough, straight away, there's no going to train in the wilderness, there's no delay. Bang, it's Bruce going to take revenge for the insult. Whip, close in, and you just know, okay, next, vengeance. And we cut from there to the Japanese school, the Honkyu school, where the judo class is going on. And Bruce's introductory shot is quite tricky. If you notice, when they're doing the judo, there's a guy got to be thrown right past the door just before Bruce opens the door, and you can actually see the guy doing the throwing look up and check the camera positioning before he does the throw. That's the kind of thing you notice when you see the film 50 times. There he is, takes a look, takes the throw, and then we move up beyond that and through the door. And again, this is another one of the major sets constructed up at Golden Harvest for the film, and a lot of detail went into it, and it's a very strikingly well-designed set with the red doors at either end, and nice depth to it. And here's Bruce And we know he's come to avenge the insult, and the Chinese audience was like, what's now? What's going to happen next?
Here. What do you want him for?
I'm returning this to him.
Oh, I see. Okay.
You can take this from me and then get out of here. Whenever you're ready, I'll take on any Japanese here.
And here's the first Japanese guy to come into battle. And this gentleman's name is Lei Chiu-chun, or Max Lee, though at the time he used the stage name as Sifu Jai. He's a veteran of the Chinese circus. He was a circus performer who began working as a stuntman and a supporting player in action films. And the last time I saw him, he was selling health food products in Sha Tin. He's got his own company, he's doing that now. He appeared in a lot of other movies. You can see him in Drunken Master with Jackie Chan. And he has the distinction, if that is a distinction it be, of being the first guy to get hit by Bruce Lee in Fist of Fury. This is Chan Lung, Peter Chan, who had worked with Bruce on The Big Boss, and also a veteran Hong Kong stuntman and supporting part player, an action guy. You can see him as a key member of Sammo Hung's team of players. He had a good acting part in Spooky Encounters, and now he's retired from the industry, and he knows a lot about Bruce, but he's very reluctant to talk. He always says he doesn't want to be seen to be riding on the coattails of the legend of this great fighter.
Surround him!
It's ironic, we got a shot here very similar to a Japanese samurai film from the Chambara films. So despite the fact that this film is in a sense is anti-Japanese or anti a certain kind of Japanese person, a lot of the imagery is similar to the great samurai films, and this is like that. Notice Bruce, he's trying to take his jacket off, he actually forgets one of the buttons, has to go back for it. Again, something you notice when you've watched the film 50 times. And now we have a great breakthrough, a great moment in Hong Kong film choreography as Bruce staged this amazing sequence where he's knocking down these opponents with these multiple kicks. And if you just think about the timing necessary, both from Bruce's point of view to catch these moving targets, and also from the stuntmen to be in the right place at the right time to get kicked without getting hurt. Extraordinary. And quite right, this guy's like, what are we dealing with here? And I spoke to one of the stuntmen who worked on this scene, Zebra Pan, Banmajai, and he says that originally it was quite different, and the original choreographer, Honyan Git, came in with his version of what the choreography was going to be like. And Bruce heard him out, and then he said, no, how about this? And starts doing all the kicks and this, and started, as Zebra Pan said, started doing Bruce Lee. And that's how this sequence came to be, and after that, basically the fights were down to Bruce. But this element here with the dummies, I mean, that's very 1970s kung fu movie, and I think that's something maybe that Bruce was talked into doing. He was much more into the reality. You see, he takes a shot then, because he's being kicked from all sides, so there's a logic to the scene. When there's too many of them, he pulls out the Senjikwan, the nunchaku. Strange, actually, the Japanese wouldn't have seen this weapon before, because actually they probably would have seen it, because it was most famous at that era as a weapon that was used by Okinawan karate specialists. So they might well have seen it. And really you have a whole generation of directors and stuntmen in this sequence, and people who went on to really make the Hong Kong film industry what it would be over the next couple of decades. The nunchaku, strangely enough, became quite a cause célèbre in England, and where they were banned and cut from the British release prints of the Bruce Lee movies. So the fans in England don't really get a chance to see Bruce using this weapon. I'm not quite sure why. I guess it was such an appealing weapon that the British censors were scared that young people might start using it. And in later films, the films like New Fist of Fury or Fist of Fury 2, the pseudo-sequels and sequels to Fist of Fury, the nunchaku, this weapon, has taken on like an iconic status. It's like Life of Brian, the followers of the good, the followers of the shoe, and you have the followers of the nunchaku. And so this weapon, I think it's really become totally synonymous with Bruce Lee. When you see a pair of these nunchaku, you think of Bruce Lee, you think of the Bruce Lee movies. Now Feng Yi coming out to battle. Feng Yi, not a Japanese, he's a Chinese actor, but he was always cast as Japanese. He played Japanese fighters way back in the black and white Wong Fei-hung films with Quan Ta-hing, this long-running series of martial art movies that kind of established the genre. And because of his build and I guess the way he looks, he was cast as a Japanese samurai, a Japanese fighter. So it was kind of obvious when they were doing Fist of Fury that he would come in and play one of the school's chief teachers at the Japanese school. Curiously, though, the technique he uses and his postures don't really look like karate. They're more like Chinese Tai Chi, so there's an interesting mix going on. You could also see Feng Yi in the very first Golden Harvest film, Angry River, in which he plays a monk, and he does Kung Fu style in there. And it might seem strange having the chief instructor is this rather middle-aged, burly guy, but I think Bruce may be making a statement that often in American schools, and maybe others around the world, you'd have a martial arts school full of these young, healthy guys, and then you'd have the instructor would be this, burly, out-of-shape guy. The flip there done by Yuen Wah, who's Bruce Lee's stunt double, both in this film and in Enter the Dragon, for the flips. So anytime you see Bruce doing an acrobatic flip, it's actually Yuen Wah as his stunt double. Bruce, I think, in his younger days, could probably do a lot more of the acrobatics himself, but he'd sustained, by this stage of his career, sustained an almost crippling back injury. An injury that actually probably would be crippling if it wasn't for his indomitable willpower. And this is great. This is what I call the John Wayne school of punching. He really just wails on it. And this is an example of Bruce modifying his own real style of Jeet Kune Do to fit the screen, because those close-range 1-inch punches are not going to look so great on camera. But if you want to wail on somebody, you really pull back from Minnesota and let them have it. Another calm after the storm, and Bruce is going to give out one of the great lines of Hong Kong cinema.
Now you listen to me. I'll only say once. We are not sick men.
And apparently back when this film played in the theatres on its first run, when he said that line, the local audiences stood up and they cheered and waved, and it was like a rock concert. And Hong Kong audiences are fairly undemonstrative, so I think that shows that Bruce had very wisely and very with great perception had tapped into a feeling that Hong Kong people had, that they had been treated like second-class citizens, even in their own country. And so by coming out and saying, we're not sick men, there was a need to hear that from somebody. And Bruce Lee, always with a flair for the dramatic, he's not content with just telling them off. He's going to make them physically eat their words, which is part of the challenge that was laid down earlier by the interpreter. He said, if any of you guys can beat me, we'll eat our words. So here he's making them eat and tells them, this time you're eating paper, and next time it's going to be glass.
This time you're eating paper.
And really ramming the message home, which is something the local audience really responded to. I mean, the energy must have been electric in the theatre when this film first played. If I had a chance to be at any premiere of any old film, I definitely would be at the premiere of Fist of Fury, I think. I mentioned earlier the Japanese influence. Japanese cinema technically was well in advance of Hong Kong film at that time. And in America, Bruce had seen many of the great Japanese swordplay actors, the Chanbara players. And some of his facial mannerisms, especially in this little moment here, it's very much like the Chanbara swordplay heroes. Mr. Wu arrives in time to see Bruce take out a last few stragglers, and quite smartly decides to hide round the corner.
I see.
Here's the main Japanese villain. He's played completely straight by Riki Hashimoto, a real-life master of Budo, expert of karate and jiu-jitsu and iaido, the Japanese art of drawing the sword.
You know the name
he
of
flew
that
in
guy?
from Japan to be in the movie, and whereas some of the other Chinese characters and the Japanese villains in the film are kind of played for laughs or played as buffoons, he's played absolutely straight.
Well, tell me
Notice
then,
the camera angle, the low
do
camera,
those
and then they're
fools honestly
enhancing his
think we're gonna
power.
take this thing lying down?
They must learn Japanese Bushido is the world's finest.
Of course. They've just never felt the sting of Japanese fists.
All right, then. Let's beat him
There are
up.
actually 2 Japanese martial arts experts brought in specifically to be in the film. And the first of them is Mr. Hashimoto.
Good.
And now we're just going to see his second-in-command there, Jun Katsumura, who would also come
Get
in
around to their school.
to be in the
Now.
movie to add
Don't come back if
a
you
level of
fail.
authenticity by having
Get going.
genuine Japanese martial art masters working in the film. And I'll look here at this really nicely laid out set. It shows the kind of budget that Golden Harvest put into the production. The bad guy's dojo. Here we are at the park in Shanghai. Meant to be 1930s, so this couple here are real trendsetters. They've got very fashionable clothing for 1930. This is one of the few exterior shots in the film. It was actually shot on location in Macau, because Hong Kong, even in 1971, Hong Kong didn't look like 1930s Shanghai. But Macau, you could just about find somewhere that passed for it. Now this sign, supposedly situated on the Bund, at a park on the Bund in Shanghai, it's become a modern myth. Maybe it's apocryphal, maybe there really wasn't a sign saying that, but certainly there was a mentality that would support a sign like that. So as a symbol, I mean, it symbolizes the oppression of Chinese people, the idea they could not walk into their own park, that there was a place in China where Chinese people were not allowed to go. Here's this bunch of Japanese, and the guy beckoning Bruce over is actually Yun Hua, who was Bruce's stunt double both in this film and in Enter the Dragon, as I mentioned earlier, for the high flips. A former classmate of Jackie Chan, and probably the best acrobat in terms of doing that kind of stunt in Hong Kong. And later an actor in his own right. I mean, he was in Eastern Condors, Dragons Forever, the Jackie Chan movies, and Sammo Hung films. And this brief flurry of action is leading up to another great cinematic moment. Again, the fact whether or not the signboard actually existed historically is less important. What's important is in this next moment that Bruce shatters it, and in shattering it, shatters that stereotype that Chinese are weaklings in their own country. Now we're back at Zhengmonmun, and if you look at the foreground there's a guy and a girl sparring, and the guy is actually the very young Jackie Chan. We'll come back to him in a moment, you can see them more clearly. And these sequences choreographed by Honyan Git, which is why the style is very old-fashioned. It's not like the style of Bruce Lee's own fight sequences in the film. So you see diverse hands at work. There's Nora Miao, brief action, and here's Jackie with his back to the camera, sparring, coming round. It looks very different in those days. I'm sure he's embarrassed that people recognize him as an extra, and he's become the greatest superstar in Hong Kong film thereafter. And here come the Japanese to trash the place. And this whole sequence choreographed by Honyan Git. And that's really, I think, where the dividing line is between the guys working on this film. All the fight sequences where Bruce is directly involved were shot by Bruce himself and choreographed by Bruce himself, with some input maybe from Honyan Git. And these sequences, all the fights where Bruce himself is not directly going into action, Honyan Git had a free hand. And Honyan Git was an experienced choreographer and a great martial artist of the northern kung fu style. And you really can't blame people for not being as up-to-date or ahead of their time as Bruce Lee, because frankly nobody in Hong Kong, and actually nobody in Hollywood, was at the same stage that Bruce Lee was in terms of shooting choreographed fight films. Nobody could match him. And in fact later, I think in terms of shooting action of any kind, as he developed as a director, he would have been a match for anybody in the world. So Honyan Git really supplying some of the typical mass combat, arms swinging, legs waving, Hong Kong style action that you'd see in the late 60s and early 70s.
Yeah, okay.
And James Chen in a moment gets his moment, his chance to shine. And again, you know, it's a shame in a way, because he probably would have been a much bigger star if Bruce Lee hadn't come back. And instead, he went on to become a supporting player, and in more recent years, a bad guy. And the last film I saw him in was Gambling Ghost with Sammo Hung, and I think he retired after that, and he lives in Taiwan now. Doubled there for that, for the foot sweeps. But still, he was a Peking opera exponent, and still a pretty good martial arts fighter in this kind of film. this is one of the few times he actually fought in a film. He was normally, as I said, cast in these patriarchal or avuncular roles and didn't actually go into action. There's Lei Kun, and a little bit of comedy from him, which the audience would expect. He was one of Hong Kong's leading comic actors. He passed away a few years ago.
Stop it! Stop it! Ah!
It's interesting to note the layout of the school. I mean, with the courtyard outside, the staircase, because I think the blueprints for that set design became the stock design for a martial arts movie and a Golden Harvest film. Because you see it in subsequent 1970s films like The Tournament. Obviously not the same set, but the same blueprints have been used. So this became like, after Fist of Fury, this was the set style for a traditional kung fu school. James Chen taking some injuries there as he protects the portrait, which is, as I mentioned earlier, a portrait of the real Fot Yun Gap, this great Chinese martial arts master. And he suffered. Fot Yun Gap was somebody who came to Shanghai having studied a variety of different styles. And rather than open a school with one particular fighting style, he formed a school where Chinese people would come and learn martial arts to help make the nation strong. And so he wanted to combine the styles together, so he called it Zheng Mo Mun, meaning that it was a doorway through which you could step to become excellent in martial arts, regardless of style. In that sense, I guess he was a forerunner of Bruce Lee, because that's pretty much what Bruce Lee said, that the real truth in combat was beyond styles and systems.
Oh my God. Help me.
He suffered in later life from jaundice, Fot Yun Gap, which is why he had the nickname Yellow-Faced Tiger. It wasn't yellow in the pejorative sense of being a Chinese person, and that Chinese people are sometimes referred to as being yellow, but because he physically was ill, and so he had this colour, this facial appearance because of his jaundice, and so he was called Yellow-Faced Tiger. And he was in fact allegedly rumoured to have been poisoned, though the film obviously extrapolates from that to have this whole story of the revenge and everything, which didn't actually take place historically as far as we know. But Fot Yun Gap, a real person, and actually the Zheng Mo Mun as an entity has survived in China and in Hong Kong and elsewhere in the world, with people operating schools under that name.
What's this?
In the staging of this scene, it's very much
all thanks to you.
theatrical, everybody lining
And
up
where
to
have
say
you
their
been all
lines.
day?
And this is, I guess, one of the drawbacks of
You've been around
Lawway's
to the Hong Kong school,
directorial
causing
style.
trouble.
And he's somebody, I think, who was a competent director, certainly prolific, but he never really developed a style that leapt out of the screen and spoke for itself. And so it's very easy to see the sequences in Fist of Fury where Bruce Lee had the helm, and those which are directed in like an older style, which are the scenes shot by Lo Wai.
So what made you do such a thing? They came round here and attacked all of us. And they said if we didn't hand you over in 3 days' time, they'd be back here again to close the school and have us arrested.
If you want my opinion, let him do it again.
What's that? How can you say that?
Chen was right. Why do we let him walk all
And here are
over
the
us?
students disputing among themselves as to whether they should take up arms against the oppressors or whether they should
To them, they'll kill
follow
you.
tolerance, which is, of course, one of the great Confucian virtues, to be tolerant in the face of aggression. And, of course, at the end, particularly for a film that was set in the 1930s, there was no choice. You really had to take up arms against the people oppressing not only China, but, of course, the rest of the world.
Leave Shanghai.
Not me.
Why not?
And
I
it's
can't
interesting,
leave you
I've
in
often
trouble.
spoken to Japanese people, because probably the biggest market for Hong Kong films, and certainly for Bruce Lee outside of Asia, outside of Hong Kong, is Japan. And I wonder why Japanese people like Fist of Fury so much, when the villains themselves are Japanese. But I think that there's a perception that quite rightly, that the Japanese villains in this movie are from a particular kind of militarist, right-wing Japanese people that had control during World War II, and that today's enlightened Japanese society can look at that with a bit of distance and a bit of perception. And I think that's very necessary, not just in regard to looking at Fist of Fury, but other films as well, that people accept that there's elements of every nation's history that we want to sweep under the carpet. And I'm sure Japanese militarism to the main is something they would like to forget about, just as there are aspects of British history that probably would not bear examination. So regardless of
And
the
don't
fact
think you'll
that
be running
it's
out on us.
such an
No one's going to blame you.
stridently anti-Japanese film, Fist of Fury very popular in Japan.
That's right. Of course we won't. Surely we agree on that.
We're not gonna blame you.
You see, do you see how many friends you have? Every one of us here. We understand why you don't want to leave this place, but have you forgotten what teacher always said? Think of the school, if not of yourself. Teacher's death and now this only increases the burden on all of us. For our sake, you must go tomorrow morning. You there,
Yes.
buy him a train ticket for tomorrow.
Bruce agreeing reluctantly to leave town, and of course everybody in the audience knows that he can't, because basically the film's over if he actually does run away from the action. Stock shot of night, an interior shot there, and the street, you'll see this a bunch of times. This is actually the only interior street set used in the film. And a nighttime encounter between Nora Miao's character and the character played by Bruce Lee. And in this scene we get the first idea that there's something between them beyond just being fellow students of Fot Yun Gap. This sequence is actually quite atmospheric. Nice use of shadows. The lighting in the film, interesting the way that often it favors Bruce in a way that illuminates this energy inside of him. And sometimes you think that the camera captures aspects of people that maybe aren't even apparent when you meet them in real life. Though I think Bruce Lee probably in real life was striking as well. From everybody I've spoken to who's met with him, they all say he was a really extraordinary character. But on film, I mean, that element I think was intensified, and you really felt that there was somebody on screen. You see this shot here where he just seems to be illuminated from within. And there are people probably who in real life were technically handsomer than Bruce Lee, but on camera that doesn't come across. So this is, I think, part of what makes somebody a superstar of that caliber, is this sheer presence on the screen.
Must stay with teacher. You go to bed.
And she leaves Bruce to this lonely vigil. He looks up again to this portrait of Fot Yun Gap, this legendary hero. And then this sequence, which is very atmospheric, is he hears somewhere else in the house the people who've murdered his master talking about the crime. And really, all he has to do is kind of walk from A to B. But with Bruce Lee in a film, every moment that he's on camera, he tries to make something out of it. And you can see the way he moves like a cat through the dark. It turns something that would really, in another film, would be very mundane into something really quite interesting. And he's not sure where they are. We're following from his point of view. And this kind of sequence, I see the hand of Bruce Lee, that he directed part of it, as opposed to handling the directing chores over to Lo Wei.
Did anyone see
Interesting acting choice here as well, as he comes next to the window and he hears them talking about the plot, very conveniently telling the audience and Bruce what's happened. And you notice his expression doesn't go into the kind of rage and fury that we might expect, but there's a kind of a calm acceptance of the fact that now he's going to have to take revenge, that there's no way he can leave Shanghai, and maybe he'll die.
No one suspects us, and so then we can, the pair of us, disappear tomorrow morning.
Yeah,
All right?
okay.
On the left, on Git, the film's action director, and of course the big boss from the film of the same name. And Bruce identifies the other man as being a Japanese because of that undergarment that he's wearing, a uniquely Japanese item of clothing.
I'm afraid of him? I'm not. Even though they say he's so good. Look at him, he's just a young fool.
Hey!
And I think it's a sign of Bruce's mastery of choreography that he's fighting here with these two guys who evidently are not athletes. They're not young athletes or stuntmen. But he choreographs them in such a way that every move works. And here, the Fist of Fury. This, I guess, is the title character, because in the Chinese script for the film, reference is made to the fact that he has a Fist of Fury, that Bruce Lee's character, Chen Jun, has this unstoppable punching technique that will, if he connects with it, will kill somebody. And this is the first time we see it used here. Again, we see Bruce's flair for the dramatic, because he doesn't leap straight into action against the second man, against Han Yan Git, but he gives a break here to build up the tension. The audience knows that the second killer is still hiding somewhere else in the kitchen, and knows that this awesome avenger has caught up with him. Movements there which are completely the opposite of what Bruce Lee taught his own students, but for film they work wonderfully well. And this great moment here where he's just pounding the guy to death and expressing all of that rage that's been bottled up. And again, I mean, Bruce Lee really underrated as an actor. I think people don't appreciate that screen acting calls upon shifts of tone and facial expression and body movement that are different from those of a theatre actor. This scene, if they ever do a Naked Gun version of Fist of Fury, this gentleman, Tian Feng, he should wake up, eat the biscuits for breakfast, and then read the note saying that the biscuits are poisoned. Here he wakes up and luckily doesn't eat the biscuits. He reads the note first. Maybe this wasn't the smartest way for Bruce to communicate that these biscuits are full of poison, and that's why Sifu's dead. But that's the way he does it, and luckily Tian Feng isn't hungry, so he doesn't eat them first.
Captain! 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 Quickly! Quickly!
And here we get our first look at the upstairs set of Zheng Momun, of the martial arts school. And it really is fully realised that the whole place, every area has been created on the soundstage at Golden Harvest, and it all fits together. And if you look at many of the other Hong Kong films of the period, a lot of them were shot mainly in exteriors, because obviously it's much cheaper to shoot out of doors. But even interiors, they didn't really have that attention to detail. And there was a sense, I think, with Fist of Fury that the first Bruce Lee film, The Big Boss, which had been shot entirely on location in Thailand, that it was great at what it did, but that if you were going to do the first Hong Kong Bruce Lee movie and you were going to shoot it at a studio, it had better look better and different than what had gone before. And that attention to detail is very apparent from the way that the place, all the sets are designed. Even though there's certainly an economy as well. I mean, this street turns up again and again. It's like the only street in Shanghai.
All right, let's go back inside. Come on.
And after dead bodies are found, no one's quite sure how to react or what their next move is. Though, of course, Tian Feng knows that it's actually
I've never
Chen
seen
Jun.
anything like it.
It's Bruce Lee's character
Who could have
who's
done
killed the
such a
two murderers and avenged
Well,
Sifu's
whoever
death.
it was, they're going to blame it on us.
How can they blame us? We're all totally innocent.
Yeah, God only knows. But I'll bet they blame the Qingwu school.
What on earth does it matter? It's nothing to do with us.
They were employed by us. This is not Chinese territory. This is the international settlement. We must find the killer first.
I have done. They were killed by Chen.
What?
Are you sure?
He left me a note that said, teacher was poisoned by Feng and Chen. I suppose he's hiding somewhere around here. Eh? So he's hiding. I can't see how that'll
You
help.
see the centre
Yeah,
of the
that's
frame there.
typical.
A young
Why couldn't you
actor,
have told
a
us
good-looking
already?
guy
Running
named
away
Lao
to?
Wing,
Yeah, well, we're gonna have to
speaking
find him
now.
quickly.
And he was
Twilight so big. Where do we
discovery
look
of
first?
Lo Wei and hired to be in the film Big Boss, playing actually a villainous role, playing the son
There
of
is
the Big
one
Boss,
thing that
and
might
he's
help
killed
us
at the
find
end of
him.
the film by Bruce Lee.
And that is, he
And he
doesn't
came from
know
a
Shanghai very
theatrical
well.
family,
Let's
Lao
organize
Wing.
a search.
His parents had been in the business. His mother was
We'll
an
settle
actress.
this.
And
But we
he
must
was
find
a
Chen
student of
first.
karate and signed up by Lo Wei as a new face. This is meant to be a dog. Actually, it's a rabbit. And some great face acting by Bruce. If you really wanted to read interpretation into the film, I know that Bruce was somebody who felt that there was too much violence, too much bloodletting in Hong Kong films. So he wanted to find a rationale behind why his character would behave as he does. And in this film, I think you could argue that Bruce, from the events at the beginning of the film, is driven temporarily insane, that Chen Jun becomes this avenging madman. And at the end, after vengeance is accomplished, that kind of force leaves him. I don't know if it's intentional, or I'm sure no one sat down and analysed the script in those terms back in '71. But certainly you can read that, and certainly his performance here is not that of a sane and ordinary person. I mean, he's almost looks like the blind swordsman Zatoichi, and then looks at his master's grave, and you can see the feeling on his face of loss. And then Nora Miao arrives, and his first reaction is to get up and fight and to unleash the fist of fury again. So a lot of stuff happening with Bruce Lee's performance, and I sometimes read reviews where people say, oh yes, of course, you know, he was great at fighting and all that stuff, but he couldn't act. And I think he's probably one of the most underrated screen actors that of this period, certainly of Hong Kong films and of other movies, and partly that's why he's endured, because of course in any film, for most of the time, he wouldn't be fighting. He has to act for the rest of the picture.
It's me.
And the scene coming up is the nearest thing that Bruce ever got to a love scene in a movie, this romantic scene between him and Nora Miao. And it's interesting, the staging of it, because in the Hollywood tradition, when people have something to say to each other, when they want to reveal their innermost feelings or ambitions, they really sit down face to face and they have a heart-to-heart talk. But the way these things are normally staged in Hong Kong or Chinese productions is it's very much like a theatre play. People go to walk at diagonals to each other and gaze off in the distance and communicate their innermost feelings in a more abstract way.
It isn't that.
This scene kind of treads the balance between the two, as sometimes the two characters are
I don't want you
walking
involved.
diagonal to each
How are you
other,
going to do that?
and eventually they are face to face. So I think there's a balance there between the Eastern and Western sensibility. The Eastern sensibility being that it's difficult to talk about
Still you won't.
intimate
Well,
matters,
tell me.
even with somebody you're in love with. And the Western way, which is basically
I don't
the
know
American
why
way,
not.
the Hollywood way in films, is that people talk these things out at great length. And here's an example of the Chinese or Hong Kong style staging of a scene. She's got something she really needs to say to him,
We used to trust
and she
each
goes
other
off
before.
so that they're both in
And I
frame,
don't know.
but she's gazing off into
Especially when I could
distance
help
and
you.
telling him what's on her mind.
Changed so much.
And it's almost
That's
like a
not true.
dance where the two people are in the same shot at the same time but are moving in different directions. And Fist of Fury is interesting because it's a film where I think because of Bruce's Hollywood background, he'd been in Hollywood films and television series before coming back to Hong Kong to make these films. He was constantly saying, no, let's make it more real.
Yes, I know.
The fight should be more real, the
As much
the
as
conversations, the communication between people should be more real.
I believe you.
Don't ever doubt me.
And the graveyard itself, yet another interior at the now sadly defunct Golden Harvest Studios.
Do you remember all the
And again,
plans
we
for
have this
yesterday?
unusual staging where you would expect two people who are sharing their memories and their shared dream to be face to face and eye to eye, and yet the blocking is they're actually back to back, and this allows in the moment for a pair of close-up shots, which I think were shot as inserts because the background doesn't really match the background of the actual set that we're seeing now.
I'd do the housework. Then I'd come round and collect you here. And we'd go and bring the kids home from school. And now, what'll happen? Will any of it come true?
I'm sure it will.
If you go on like this, you know it might never happen.
Don't think that. Of course it'll work out.
Do you really love me?
Of course I do. You mean more to me than anyone.
Now a moment which I guess no one's really been waiting for, which is Bruce's first screen kiss. I think in a Bruce Lee movie you're waiting for the first punch to be thrown. This is actually the only screen kiss that he really had in his career, because his character in the films, of course, is always portrayed as a fighter rather than a lover. But the staging is like a fight scene. Full face, tight shot of the eyes, and then the kiss. And in a lot of the scenes where Bruce is about to fight somebody, it's exactly the same editing. You see his face, then you see his eyes, and then he kicks somebody. And luckily for Nora, in this scene, he's kissing her instead. But the actual staging is more or less the same. Of course, this is very tame by today's standards, but for the days of the 1970s, I mean, Hong Kong was still... There was a limit to what you could show on camera in terms of couples being intimate with each other. Normally, they would just exchange loving glances and the music would play and you'd dissolve to them practicing their swordplay together.
Please tell me now about your plans.
Nora Mao, interestingly, apart from her roles in the Bruce Lee movies, was groomed as a warrior woman. If you look at her in films like The Comet Strikes and The Blade Spares None and The Invincible Eight, she's a powerful swordswoman, and it's only in the Bruce Lee movies that she kind of plays the stereotypical supportive, loving Chinese wifey woman. Otherwise, she's a gung-ho kung fu fighter. And after the Bruce movies, she went on to do other action films and other dramatic films.
Somewhere where they'll never find us. Somewhere where we'll be safe.
Nora Mao's interviewed on the Bruce Lee documentary, Bruce Lee the Legend, actually the second Bruce Lee documentary. She talks about her experiences with Bruce.
Does the name Wu mean anything?
I think so.
I think he knows about Teacher's death.
Wasn't he that interpreter who came with the Japanese? Could he be the right one?
And you see the production value here in this Japanese setting that was created again at Golden Harvest Studios. And it's got its waterfall and the plants and, you know, every aspect of it. It looks like you would expect the Japanese home to be in that concession area of Shanghai in the 1930s. And you can actually follow this gentleman, Mr. Hashimoto, all the way in from the garden in one take and inside into his study, and have the other actors approaching across the stairs, and it's all in one take, and very different from the style of Hong Kong film previously, which was you shot something and you cut, and you shot something and you cut, and you didn't really care about the incidental details of the piece. But there's at least here a token towards making a film in, let's say, the Japanese or the Hollywood style, where you have a uniformity to different elements, from the production design to the acting, to the editing.
Now he's dead. We must do something about them. Let me avenge his death now.
Of course. There's no point in waiting any longer. No one will say they didn't ask for it.
I'll go get the men ready.
Hold on. Sir,
The dynamic
if
of the
we do it
scene is
like
interesting
that,
as
we'll get far
the
too
Peter
involved.
Lorre of Asia
What can it
comes
do?
forward, Wei-ping O.
Oh?
And of
What do
course,
you propose, then?
the Japanese want
There's
to
one
go and
idea that
destroy
might
the
work.
school, to destroy
Let's hear it,
Jingmonmun
then.
and kill all the Chinese
Oh,
fighters there.
someone else
And
will
he
be
has a
the
way
police,
to use the
and that
political
someone else will be
situation in
the police.
Shanghai to their advantage. So he's the Iago figure, let's say. He's
It's
this
like this.
crafty
First, the man
middleman
will chance.
who's creating
That
the
is to
problems
say,
for
give him
everybody
an
else.
ultimatum. Either he surrenders, or the police close the school.
And I always
Chen is too
joke with
gallant to let
people
them
and
do
say that I like
He would have it on his
Fist of
conscience
Fury
forever.
because it's like the kung fu
So he
version of
surrenders,
Macbeth,
and then we do
in
what
that
we
it's
like,
short, it's bloody,
with
and
no one
it's full of
suspecting that
revenge.
we arranged it. Then, my friends, you can have your revenge on him. Well, tell me, what do you think of my little plan?
You may be one of Japan's best friends.
I do my best, and you agree this is the best way. Yes, the only way to get Chen, as I suggest.
Yes. You go ahead.
Right.
And here is the director himself, Lo Wei, who had actually been an experienced actor, a theatre actor, and a film actor in Shanghai. And he was actually something of a matinee idol. I know it's perhaps hard to believe from the way he looked at the time he made Fist of Fury.
They came to us first.
But from being an actor, he
and of
moved
course
into
he would never have gone
directing,
anywhere
moved to
near
Hong
those
Kong, had some success as a director at Shaw Brothers.
You have to admit that.
His reputation
I've
was that
just
he
been
was the
explaining
first
it.
$1 million
If they hadn't come here
director, not because he got paid $1 million, but because that's how much one of his films made
now you tell
at the
me how
local
your
box
men Feng
office.
and Tian died.
And he often made
You
cameo
know?
appearances in the films he directed.
idea.
Of course you do.
No, we don't.
It was Lo Wei's wife, Liu Lianghua, who was a famous actress at that time, who actually flew to Los Angeles to negotiate the contract Golden Harvest executed with Bruce Lee to bring him back to Hong Kong to make films. Because Bruce Lee initially was quite resisted the idea of coming to Hong Kong to make films again. He really thought it was a step back because he knew that the Hong Kong films technically weren't as advanced as American ones. And he really wanted to be a star in
But
Hollywood.
he's not here.
But Mrs. Lowe managed to talk him into it, and Bruce signed the deal and flew off to Thailand to shoot The Big
No, we
Boss,
don't know.
which
We're
at that
looking for
time
him
was being
too.
shot by another director. And
believe
because Golden Harvest really
something.
suddenly realised this was going to be their big make or break movie,
I've told you.
they replaced him
We
with
don't know
Lo
where he
Wei,
is.
who then flew
And
out
we're
to
telling you the
Thailand,
truth. You'll
took
have
over
to
the
believe
production, and that began the working relationship between him and Bruce Lee. And obviously, as the film did so well, The Big Boss was a huge box office hit all over Asia. When it came time to do the next movie, which is going to be shot in Hong Kong, they kept the team together. Lo Wei was directing, Han Ying-git was going to be the action director, and of course Bruce Lee to be the star. Back to the Japanese dojo, and from my days of martial arts training, I don't think I can imagine. I can't remember that we ever had this kind of entertainment of an evening. But I guess being away from home for so many years and stuck in Shanghai, the Japanese karate masters, wanted a taste of home. So you've got this Japanese stripper, and there's Robert Baker, the only Westerner to play a leading role in the film. And Bob Baker was a student of Bruce's in America, who learnt martial arts from Bruce, from Stockton, and came out specifically to work with Bruce on the movie, and got his 15 minutes of fame. And again, I mean, like the Screen Kiss a bit earlier, this is really rather risque material for 1971 in Hong Kong. And it's true, even I think to this day, that if you do a film with any kind of nudity in Hong Kong, it's going to be what we say is a Category 3 film or an adult film. You can actually have all the violence you want, and there's no issue. But as soon as you get into sex, you've got a problem. And it's actually the opposite in England. In the UK, basically, you can have all the sex you want, but as soon as you get into the violence, you've got a problem. So I guess maybe the truth is somewhere between the two. Maybe in America, where you can have equal amounts of sex and equal amounts of violence, and nobody really minds. And on the Chinese print of Fist of Fury, when Bob Baker's character, the Russian Petrov, speaks, the dubbing of his English is actually executed by Bruce Lee, who does he's got like an echo chamber on his voice, but you can recognize Bruce's voice as being the voice of Petrov. On only the Chinese version, on the English dub, it's just the regular dubbing artiste.
What a time we're having. I've never seen anything like. Nothing ever like this.
Now that I'm here
Bob
in
Baker,
Shanghai,
unfortunately,
I'm your man.
passed away a few years ago from a heart
Very
attack.
gratifying to hear
And
that.
in the years afterwards, I don't think he ever made another film.
What's that?
He returned to America
What did he
and
say?
pursued various different livelihoods.
Robin's just
Towards the end
arrived
of his
to join our
life, he was a
school here.
bartender,
From Russia.
and
He had a
he
little
was discovered by a
misunderstanding
long-time
and decided
Bruce
to
Lee
take a
fan, and he was
holiday
brought to
here with
England.
us.
And I think the only time he ever spoke publicly
You're saying
about working
here,
with Bruce was at a
nothing to
convention in
worry
the
about
UK a
here
few
at
years
all.
ago,
We're all good
and talked
friends
about
here,
his
you
life.
know.
And then he passed away just a couple of years after that. So it's good in a way that he'd actually record his experiences, because he was working and staying with Bruce during this amazing last period of Bruce's life, the 3 years that he was in Hong Kong making the films which made him a legend. So Bob Baker's reminiscences are particularly interesting.
I feel dizzy, so dizzy.
Hey, 3 more cars, 3 more cars.
Wei Ping
huh?
Oh, of
Hey,
course,
wait now,
was
come back here.
also tapped
Well,
by
now,
Bruce to appear in Way of the
really
Dragon,
wanna go out the
where he plays
door,
the outrageously
like a
camp
Chinese.
right-hand man of the big boss, played by restaurant owner John Ben. And he was it really took this character from this movie, and then Bruce thought, okay, we'll bring him into the 1970s and make him even more outrageous. Tracking shot here, and they never miss a chance to show off this extravagant set.
Get up.
The rickshaw, that now happily
Where
defunct
to?
mode of transport,
Just go along the North Road.
and little does he know it's Bruce at the wheel. Same old street set, redressed to show the Japanese school in the foreground, and then he runs off the set and out on location again. It's in Macau, and the Portuguese colony of Macau, which is soon to become part of China again, was the setting for several exterior scenes, because you could just about say, okay, this is Shanghai 1930, but there's nowhere in Hong Kong, even in 71, that looked like that. So you've got these street sequences. Also shot day for night, which is why you've got that curious light and shadow effect. These were actually shot in broad daylight with night filters on to match the fact this is meant to take place at night. And then we're back on the same street set as before, but now redressed to show another part of Shanghai.
Hey, hold it here. Where are you going? This is a dead end.
As I mentioned before, there's a conflict of styles in Fist of Fury. And what we're about to see here is something that was very much a part of the existing Hong Kong cinema of the time, in which martial arts heroes were depicted as having supernatural powers. Because even a man with Bruce Lee's amazing physical development, there's no way that he could physically lift up a rickshaw like this. Obviously it's on a wire, and Wei Ping Oh is sitting in the chair supported by the wires.
You tell me.
And actually, it's quite a nice wire effect here when he's thrown, because at the time, wire work is not nearly as sophisticated as it would later become with directors like Ching Siu-dong and Choi Hark. But that's kind of one of the hokier moments. In The Big Boss, there's another moment when Bruce Lee hits somebody and they go through the wall and leave an outline behind them. And you can almost see that's the imprint of the established Hong Kong filmmakers.
All right now. Start talking.
Extraordinary thing about Bruce is that even though he was not the tallest or the broadest of people in reality or in person, the one attribute he has that makes him look like a giant is the forearms. I mean, he really had Popeye-defined forearms. Every time you see a shot of him with his shirt rolled up, the forearm definition is extraordinary. And indeed, he was meant to be a forearm fanatic. I mean, he trained every kind of exercise you could come up with to add power to the forearm. He did it.
Have pity on me. Please, sir.
And again, there's this internal logic to the piece. This guy doesn't pose a threat, so Bruce is actually going to let him live. And then very unwisely, Mr. Wu decides he's going to use the Flintstone method of killing somebody. And he too feels the fist of fury. Look at that forearm.
Have pity. Who had pity for Huyanjia?
The stock shot there of the sunrise. And just to talk about something else, I often hear people talk about Bruce Lee's acting style and say that it was very mannered and that he was over the top. But if you look at him in the Hollywood movies that he made, in the Hollywood TV series, he's acting in a much more naturalistic style, a kind of method style. And I think he adapted his acting style to fit the film. If he would have come to Hong Kong and just done Hollywood-style, low-key acting, for most of the audience who were used to the more extravagant acting style of the period, he would have seemed to not be acting, and he would have been regarded as a bad actor for that reason. So I think you can say that he applied the same philosophy to acting as he did for martial art, which is that he used the technique that fit the circumstance. And when he came back to Hong Kong, he found that everybody was very flamboyant and outspoken and loud in their acting style. And so he took that, and also the style of the Japanese Chanbara actors, and took that as well, added that together with the more realistic Hollywood style, and then that was how he would act in his Hong Kong films, which, from Bruce's point of view, he never really anticipated or wanted them to be released worldwide. His view, of course, was that he would, after Enter the Dragon, be directing and making his own films based primarily out of Hollywood, and then he would have complete control over the production. And I think the acting style would have changed to fit that kind of movie. Here's Lo Wei again, as the police inspector having to confront a very angry Japanese karate master.
We'll close the school.
And it's unfortunate, really, that the relationship between Lo Wei and Bruce Lee, which was really a productive one, has been overshadowed by the fact that they subsequently fell out. Originally, the plan was that they would do a third film together, A Man Called Tiger, which was to be shot in Japan. Bruce declined to make the film, so Lo Wei made it anyway with another leading light of the 70s kung fu boom, Jimmy Wong Yu of one-arm boxer fame. And subsequently there was a major falling out between Lo Wei and Bruce Lee over who actually should take credit for the first two films. Aside from the fact that that's unfortunate, I think if you really want to see who was responsible for the excellence of Big Boss and Fist of Fury, you really should look at the other films of Lo Wei and the other films of Bruce Lee, and I think it's obvious that Bruce Lee really brought a lot of his own talent and ability to the films. Bruce here, and not particularly convincing old man makeup, but it's quite tricky because at one hand he's got to look enough like an old man that the other characters don't recognize him, but he's got to look enough like Bruce Lee that the audience will recognize him. And this is evidence of him, like, he loved to play dress up, I think, and he wanted to play with this character in different ways. And this is meant to be the shot when you realize it's Bruce Lee and his face changes. Here the Japanese, and we're about to see one of the limitations of this street set, because they all climb into this car, which is a real fully functional car. Actually not bad, it looks like it could be a 1930s car. Luckily they cut, because they're going to go straight into that wall. There's no way that car would make that corner.
I'm sorry to
now we're back with Lo Wei at the Chengmongmen School, and he's trying to persuade the other members of the school to give up Bruce Lee's character. Just talk about Lo Wei for a moment. I mean, he really is a key figure in the history of Hong Kong cinema, because he could claim to discover both Bruce Lee and later, of course, Jackie Chan. And he directed, apart from Fist of Fury, some interesting movies that were shot around about the same time in the early 70s. I like The Comet Strikes. It's kind of a Hong Kong Hammer Films kung fu movie, and The Tattooed Dragon, which he shot in Thailand with Jimmy Wong Yu. Those are probably the best examples of his work in this time. Jackie Chan, of course, worked as a stuntman and a supporting player on Fist of Fury, and years later, when Lo Wei was casting a follow-on film, New Fist of Fury, he tapped Jackie to play this young patriot who's inspired by Chen Zhan, the character played by Bruce Lee in Fist of Fury. And subsequently, Lo Wei signed Jackie Chan to a multi-picture deal, But none of the films really worked. Though they have their merits, none of them really was a big box office hit. And it wasn't until Lowe loaned out Jackie to producer Sigun to make Snake in the Eagle Shadow and Drunken Master that he became a star. And subsequently, unfortunately, there's quite a bit of acrimony between Jackie Chan and Lowe when they severed the relationship, the working relationship. Jackie went to join Golden Harvest, and he was marketed for a while, quite unwisely, I think, as like a new Bruce Lee, which he obviously wasn't. And meanwhile, Lowe kept trying to recapture the former glory of Big Boss and Fist of Fury. And the best of his latter-day films is a swordplay film called Blade of Fury, which is directed by the great Sammo Hung. And some of the themes and ideas in the film, apart from the title's similarity, but some of the themes and ideas are similar between Fist of Fury and Blade of Fury. And as a note for Hong Kong movie trivia buffs, the actor James Chen Jun, actually appears in both films, in Fist of Fury, and years later in Blade of Fury as well. And just a note about the dialogue scenes, as we're seeing so many lengthy dialogue scenes. These were actually shot wild, which means that there was no sound recorded on the set whatsoever. And later they were dubbed initially into the Chinese dialect Mandarin, which is the dialect that now is spoken primarily in mainland China and in Taiwan. And the reason that they were dubbed into Mandarin initially is that that time there was kind of a seesaw between Mandarin and Cantonese as the dominant language of Hong Kong cinema. And Mandarin was actually regarded as being more classy. It was like, I guess, if you're from the north of England or south of England, or if you're from the south of America, or you're from Boston, there was this thing about which accent, which dialect was better. Of course, in the case of Mandarin and Cantonese, they're almost two entirely separate languages. So even though most Hong Kong natives would speak Cantonese in their day-to-day conversations, when they went to the movies, they would see a Mandarin film because it was felt to be a more upmarket production. And this explains why when you see theatrical releases of Hong Kong films even today, you've got two sets of subtitles, one set in English and one in Chinese. And this is because even the Chinese viewers initially maybe couldn't follow all of the dialect because it would be in their second language, in their second dialect.
It's really a matter of life or death, you know. If you do know, then you must tell me.
Well, I know where he is at night.
Huh? Tell me, where is it then?
And this exterior shot actually in Hong Kong's new territories, and you can kind of get away with it being back in the 30s because it's such a high angle and such a spare shot. Obviously, the other stuff you had to go to Macau because it's very hard to pass off Hong Kong as a backdrop for any kind of period film because it's such a constantly updated city. Here we see Lee in his second disguise in the film as this telephone repairman. I don't know if did they have Mr. Magoo back in those days? If they had Mr. Magoo, then this guy reminds me of Mr. Magoo. And a biographical note about Bruce, those are actually his real glasses that he's wearing. In the immortal words of his student, Danny Santo, Bruce really couldn't see worth a darn. And there's a great story about how when Bruce was going through his lean years in Hollywood, he couldn't even afford to get those glasses fixed. So if you look carefully, you'll see they've got wire and tape on them. And later, when he made it in Hong Kong and he had much more success, he still kept the glasses in their unrepaired state because he wanted to remind himself constantly of how far he'd come, how his life journey from the States and becoming a star in Hong Kong. And kind of a sad note, I guess, in light of things, is the fact that when he died, the glasses were buried with him. This obviously is like a caricature character, and Bruce playing to the audience. Now we see the strongman show being put on by Petrov, played by Bob Baker. And Bob Baker, when he talked about working on the film, he remembered shooting a trailer for Fist of Fury in which his character is beating up some Asian fighters. Presumably he'd be beating up the Jengwonmun students. Maybe it was these guys in the white karate suits. And this trailer had him fighting all the guys and this was intercut with Bruce Lee slowly walking down a staircase. And then they end up shoulder to shoulder, and it's like, if you want to see the fight, you have to watch Fist of Fury. And I've seen one black and white still of them shoulder to shoulder that seems to be from that trailer. But the actual footage, unfortunately, has long since disappeared. We scoured the vaults to find it. And it's kind of interesting that the show Bob Baker's putting on, that Petrov's doing, is not so much a martial arts exhibition as a strongman show. And I think this is inspired because a lot of the events that happen in the life of Fot Yun Gap, the character who's described in the movie as the late master of Bruce Lee's character, Chen Jun, a lot of the events of Fot Yun Gap's life have been transferred to the events that are happening to Chen Jun. And I think a part of the story here is the fact that there was a Western strongman who came to do a show in Shanghai, and there was a challenge between him and Fot Yun Gap. But before they could actually fight, the Western strongman thought better of it and he left town. And this film, of course, takes a step further and it posits the theory, okay, what would have happened had they really fought? So we get this kind of strongman show. And it's also important structurally because so far Bruce has been almost indestructible for the whole film and has seemed to be a martial arts Superman. And to keep any kind of tension, the audience has to believe there's somebody else in the picture who could maybe pose a serious challenge to Bruce. And obviously, martial arts wise, he's proved to be a master. So the enemy, the guy that maybe can defeat him, would have to be somebody with enormous power. So this basically is setting the audience up and saying, okay, you've seen him beat the Japanese. Now at the end, we're going to see him against this much larger Western fighter who maybe has a chance of beating him. A nice example coming up of Bruce playing to the audience, playing to the camera as he's being shouted at. You see his lips moving and he's like cursing in Chinese, but the little Japanese guy doesn't see it. But the audience would like that. I mean, and Bruce knew his audience and he played them to perfection in this film.
There's another one over there. Come on.
Right.
As I mentioned earlier, this is a caricature rather than a real character. But Bruce is very smart. I mean, I think his approach to filmmaking is the same as his approach to martial art, in that he would adapt to fit circumstance. And the reality is this kind of movie, in his estimation, wasn't going to play to a sophisticated Western audience. It was going to play to the relatively less sophisticated Asian audience. And they like that kind of thing. This is interesting. They're setting up the locale for the finale. We're seeing it now in daylight, so that when we come back at the end of the movie, the audience is already familiar. Okay, we've got this big open area. It's been established. That's where the big fight is going to take place. And here's Bruce, and I guess if this was an American gangster movie, we'd say he was casing the joint, because he's coming in disguise to see who's who and really preparing himself for what will be the final showdown.
Hate to bother you. Over here.
If only I could find that Chen. I'd enjoy killing him. It would give me great pleasure.
Yeah, but I hear he's an extremely good fighter. I've heard him called Fist of Fury. I think it'll be wiser if we concentrate on his school.
And so, of course, conveniently enough, the bad guys are sitting there discussing their evil plans, and they kind of curtail the conversation so this apparently innocuous repairman doesn't listen in. And Bruce, of course, is realized from what they've said that he has no choice. He's going to have to storm the Japanese school. And there's a nice moment here as he walks away and the mask drops.
What do you suggest?
We'll kill them, every one of them, in one stroke.
What have you thought of the consequences?
Don't worry, no one will be able to prove a thing. If we move quickly, and there are no survivors, then who can testify?
Right. Do it tonight. But God help you if you leave any alive.
Sir.
And here we are back in the indoor graveyard, and the Zhengmonwen students are looking for Chen Jun. And we get the best look we get at the grave of Fot Yun Gap. Grave sites, of course, very important in Chinese tradition because of the need to respect your ancestors. And also in Taoist practice and in Feng Shui, it's believed the position of your grave affects the fate of your ancestors. It's like I guess, a supernatural insurance policy. And there's this very neat film by Choi Siu-meng called Bury Me High that focuses on this tradition that the position of a grave will affect the fortunes of later generations.
Where is he?
I wish I knew.
into the Japanese school, and off they are to storm Jengmomon. And they're an interesting bunch. You've got the usual suspects up front, and Dad's army bringing up the rear, and they really don't look very Japanese, do they? And we get a moment, they're out of frame, and here's Chen-jun, and the stirring main theme by Joseph Koo, very reminiscent of the theme from the TV series Ironside, in which Bruce actually had a brief appearance in one episode. And Joseph Koo probably could be described as the John Williams of the Hong Kong film industry. He provided scores from many of the great films of the 70s and 80s, very much still on the scene, recently staged a concert. Now we're going to see what may well be the most brutal fight that Bruce ever filmed. But as usual, in his films there's a rationale to it. He gives them a chance to leave. He tells them that they needn't be involved, they can leave if they want to. And then when they choose to fight, then as Bruce always said, that's it, baby.
I have come here to avenge my teacher. This doesn't concern you. I'll allow you to leave. Out. 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 Out! Scram!
Coming up, we're going to see one of the great actor stuntmen of Hong Kong cinema getting decimated by Bruce, the late great Lam Ching-ying, who became better known subsequently for his role in the film Mr. Vampire. There he is coming in with a broomstick and then a whack, getting knocked out by Bruce. And this is an intense moment, treading on somebody's head. Even in a film today, you wouldn't see that. Nice moment, stuntman Ming Choi going over the table and Bruce following up. Really, that kind of movement is ahead of its time. And now look at this, Steven Seagal, eat your heart out. Feng Yi comes back into the action, and again, unlike some of the other movies made at this period, it actually made sense. There's a logic to the fight. We saw in their earlier encounter that Feng Yi's no match for Cheng Jun in terms of hand-to-hand combat. So here he's going to try to even the odds with a katana. And this is probably the most dangerous situation we see Chen Jun in the whole film, going empty hands against a blade, especially a Japanese blade. And I almost wonder whether this is Bruce's invention or whether it was something that Hon Yan-git wanted to put into the movie. Because Bruce was somebody who was always really into realism, and this is really the most unrealistic encounter in the whole film. And even the denouement is very stagey compared to the rest of the action that Bruce has done in the film. This is very much a kind of late 60s, 1970s Hong Kong movie device, the bladed weapon falling down. And it's probably one of the moments when you really do feel sorry for a bad guy. I mean, this is probably one of the most painful ends any movie bad guy's ever come to. And now the most superfluous punch in cinema history, I think. He's pretty much finished there, isn't he? Joseph Koo's score is really coming into its own as we get into the last reel. Here we have one of the two real-deal karate fighters in the movie, Jun Aramura. And you can just see from his body movement, actually just the way he holds his body, that he's genuinely a trained Japanese karate fighter, as opposed to the way the stuntmen tend to be a little looser in their movement. But his body positioning, the way he just holds himself when he's not fighting, is very much that of a Japanese karate fighter. takes him out, and then we have Petrov in a moment coming down to enter the battle. And again, on the Cantonese print, you'll hear Bruce's voice dubbing Petrov's line, "Let me take care of him."
Let me take care of him.
But not on the English dubbed version, only on the Cantonese print. Now, at this point, I should confess that I got to play the same role of Petrov in a TV remake of Fist of Fury, and I'd like to go on record of saying that Bob Baker did an infinitely better job of it than I managed to do. But it certainly was an interesting experience to kind of walk in his footsteps of being the only Westerner in a Hong Kong production. And while they're squaring up, the scoring here is very much Japanese chanbara style, with these really weird percussion instruments. And again, there's irony that you've got a film that in some senses is very anti-Japanese, but is hugely influenced by Japanese samurai cinema. Incidentally, the word chanbara is actually onomatopoeic. It's derived from the sound made by the percussionists who accompanied silent black and white Japanese movies. And I think Bruce had a hand in, I think he even maybe played one of the percussion instruments here to give the right flavour to the scene. And you have to give credit to Bob Baker, who, though an experienced martial artist and a student of Bruce's from Stockton, was not a screen fighter. And there's a big difference between fighting somebody for real and doing choreographed screen combat. And it's also, this fight, I think, is the first one of Bruce's where we really get to see all the ranges of combat, because they go in from kicking and punching range, now trapping, and then down into grappling range, and then Bruce puts into effect on screen a concept that he mentioned verbally the year before on the TV series Longstreet, the idea that when you're tied up in a grappling situation, biting is one way to get free. And the audience in Hong Kong really responded to that. It was cinematically not very visual, but the realism appeals. And this is Mai Jung-kyun, the dazzling hand. And in tradition of martial arts tradition, it's a style of fighting associated with Fot Yun Gap, which explains why Chen Jun, Bruce's character, as a student of Fot Yun Gap, is using it here. And actually, Mai Jung-kyun is identified in the Chinese script for the film as being the style devised and used by Fot Yun Gap. And looking at this, you can see why Sugar Ray Leonard always gives Bruce credit for that beautiful light jab. Power sidekick. I spoke to one of the stuntmen who worked with Bruce, and they said if he kicked for real, he had the ugliest kick you ever saw and the most powerful. And the setting up of the final encounter, it's familiar. Bruce used it in Way of the Dragon and in The Complete Game of Death. And this kick really connected. There were two stuntmen pushing Bob Baker forward, and he remembers that when Bruce's kick impacted with his face, it left a very visible dent. And you can actually see the real damage. That's not makeup there. It was a real kick that connected because the stuntman pushed him a bit too hard, and he took home a souvenir. I remember suffering a chop to the throat when I played Petrov, and there's nothing for the singing voice. Unless I guess you want to sound like Barry White. Now it's down to Riki Hashimoto as Mr. Suzuki, as Bruce has now worked his way through all the rest of the henchmen, all the rest of the students. In a moment we get another flip from Yunhua. We did all the flips for Bruce in the movie. And Bruce improvising. If you look carefully, you can see the wood's been pre-cut so that it will be sliced by the katana. Again, the logic of the film, before we saw Bruce empty-handed against a sword. Here he improvises with the wood before bringing out his trademark weapon. And an interesting variation on the Seongjikwan of the nunchaku, because this one, normally it's two sticks with a chain between them, and this almost looks like a single length of chain with like the handles wrapped round. And this is probably one of Bruce's homemade nunchakus, because he used to actually create the ones he used in the films himself, wrapping the foam around a length of chain and then painstakingly sewing it up by hand. So from this you can really see the attention to detail that Bruce brought to every aspect of the production. Now they're empty hands again, so Bruce throws away the weapon, ready for the final impact. And Jackie Chan's moment of glory as he's doubling for Hashimoto as he goes through the shoji panels. This is Jackie Chan pulled back on a wire, and a painful landing. At the time, one of the highest falls, probably the highest fall ever executed by a stuntman. And you get this wonderful moment here as the Japanese sensei expires, and the chord of the music, the whole tone of the music changes. And you get this sense of relief, of release as the fury has passed. This actually, probably if it was a Hollywood movie, is where we would end the film, with him having achieved his goal and then walking off into the sunset, the way the cowboys rode into the sunset. But of course this was a Hong Kong movie made in 1971, and particularly in the Asian region, different territories had different demands, and normally they took a pretty dim view of films in which somebody took vengeance, broke the law, and killed people, and then got away with it at the end. So there was an unwritten rule that at the end of those kind of films, the hero, no matter how justified, had to pay for his crimes. And it's sometimes interesting to look at how different filmmakers would react to the same material. This film had been directed by the prolific Hong Kong filmmaker Chang Che, who was working at Shaw Brothers at the time. I feel probably we would have seen the actual massacre. We would have seen the Japanese fighters cutting down the Jengmonmun fighters, and it would have, in Bruce's version, in this Fist of Fury, it happens off screen, and we just see the aftermath of violence, the tragedy of violence, and the emotional aspect, rather than having all that wonderful bright red fake blood that they used in that time sprayed across the screen, which is probably what Chang Che would have done with the scene. In this instance, I think Bruce's influence is such that he's basically saying, no, that kind of violence doesn't belong in this kind of film, that we're communicating a different idea. And I think throughout Bruce's work, you have a balance between the martial arts aspect, which has in it an inherently an aspect of violence, but also the philosophical aspect. And so there's a rationale behind his filmmaking that maybe is not as evident in some of the other Hong Kong films made during this period. And talk a little bit now, about the music, Joseph Koo's score. It's been said that all writers steal and great writers steal from the best, and I'm sure the same is true of composers. But the music here owes more than a little to the incidental music used by Ennio Morricone in the Sergio Leone film Once Upon a Time in the West, which was shot in 1969, a couple of years before Fist of Fury. And subsequently, when the same composer, Joseph Koo, did the music for Bruce Lee's directorial debut, Way of the Dragon, they actually lifted sections of music from Once Upon a Time in the West to use in that film for the different sequences in Way of the Dragon. And traditionally, Hong Kong cinema has borrowed from Western films in terms of the music used. And one element that's particularly prevalent in Hong Kong movie scores that's borrowed from the composers for spaghetti westerns, particularly Morricone, is the use of human voices, either angelic voices or the voices of discord, within a symphonic arrangement.
I must get through here.
And you see in the background there an early appearance by the American comedian Steve Martin in a Hong Kong film production. You see him holding his gun in the middle of the frame.
I must go in.
There he is, looking over the shoulder of the Japanese ambassador. And here's Lo Wei, in this curious role that he created for himself of this rather ambivalent character, this upright man who's walking a line, a political line, between the forces that divide Shanghai. On one level, he's a Chinese. He dresses in this very traditional Chinese way, and he's trying to use the political situation to defend the students at Zhengmomen. At the same time, he has to face the political realities and deal with the Japanese forces and also the British, who are represented by the Westerners standing outside the gates of Zhengmomen. And a few years later, Lo Wei directed New Fist of Fury, and in that film he kind of tries to redeem his character, and he talks to Nora Miao, whose character survives the first movie, and admits that in the past he didn't do what he should have done. He didn't stand up for the Chinese in Shanghai. And so in the second film, he's doing what he can to help the Patriots escape to start a new life in Taiwan.
If you have a complaint,
Japanese ambassador with the little moustache, that's de rigueur for Japanese officials in films of this era.
I'm sorry, but the Japanese consulate has filed a complaint. Chen is charged with the murder of Mr. Wu, translator at Hongqiu School. He must stand trial.
What's that? These guys have just killed most of
in a rare dramatic moment. Normally he's played in films, his character is always a buffoon, as he is in The Big Boss, Bruce Lee's first film. And a few years later he had a hit with a comedy called Shantung Man in Hong Kong, which was kind of an even more comedic version of Bruce Lee's film Way of the Dragon, in which he plays a country bumpkin coming to modern Hong Kong.
I don't like it any more than you do. But I've no choice now. I must arrest Chen.
Well, I don't know where he is. He still hasn't come back yet.
All right. In that case, why not arrest all of them?
So you honestly don't know where he is now?
And the screen brightens again as Bruce returns to Zhengmomen. And it's interesting. I mean, again, we were talking earlier about the fact that people have underrated Bruce as an actor. But I think he was, as well as being competent as an actor, he was a great reactor, in that he could actually convey feeling through body movement, and he adopted the style of Hong Kong cinema of that era, and didn't try to give the naturalistic performance that you would expect if you're working in Hollywood during that time, but he adapted his performance to the audience, which wanted that kind of larger-than-life character. But he still managed to find a lot of truth in the performance, and I think that comes through, and it's why these films, for all of their inadequacies, perhaps in terms of production values and technical filmmaking technique, they've stood the test of time, is that there is a central truth to his performance. And I think it's often in the scenes where he's not talking but just reacting that people feel something for whatever he's feeling, as in this sequence, where he's really weighing up the consequences of his actions and making the decision that he has to make this final sacrifice for Zhengmomen, and also, of course, for the Chinese people.
For your sake, blame it on Chen.
Hey, Chen's here now.
And to digress for a moment, I think the person who deserves to die in a hail of gunfire at the end of this film is whoever was responsible for Nora Miao's hairstyle, because it really is the haircut from hell. And I don't think even Dolly Parton, at the height of her fame, would wear such a style. And that's probably what's going through Bruce's mind as he was shooting this scene. Now we have the only scene that Bruce ever shot with Lo Wei, even though they did actually make 2 films together. And it's a shame, in a way, that their relationship deteriorated after making Fist of Fury, because whatever the relative talents of each person, definitely Big Boss and Fist of Fury have been 2 of the most widely seen and most celebrated martial art movies and of unarmed combat films. I mean, they must be the two that have been sold around the world year after year ever since they were made. And the score kicks back in, winning the final moment. Inspired by the end of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, of Chen Jun making the leap from life into legend, and bringing to an end a genuine classic of Hong Kong cinema, and really a favourite film of anybody who loves Bruce Lee and who loves Kung Fu movies. It's been my pleasure to see it again with you, so thank you very much for watching, and this is Bay Logan, signing off.